Good afternoon. I'm David Luberoff, the Joint Center's Director of Fellowships and Events, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's Housing Research Seminar, which will focus on some interesting and I think important new research about manufactured housing. Before we begin, just want to highlight a couple of upcoming events. We have two events coming up in the next little bit more than a month on homelessness. Next week, Jeff Olivet, Executive Director of the Interagency Council on Homelessness, will be doing an online webinar focused on some of the key findings from the most recent AHAR, annual report on homelessness. And then in March 21st, Dr. Margot Cashel will be giving the annual Dunlop Lecture. Margot, for those of you who don't know her, is a physician and researcher based in California and directed, I think, one of the most important and interesting studies on homelessness. That will be at 6:30 p.m. on Thursday, March 21st, in person at the Graduate School of Design and also online. We also have an event coming up in 2 weeks on artist-led community development initiatives in neighborhoods of color by Aisha Densmore Bay, who was one of our Meyer doctoral dissertation fellows. You can find more information about these and some other upcoming events on the Joint Center website and on our email list. If you're not on the list, you probably want to sign up. And that takes us to today's talk. Our speaker today is Chris Herbert, my colleague, friend, who is this Joint Center's managing director. Chris will be talking about a body of research that he and some colleagues at the center and a few others have been doing, examining both the potential of manufactured housing to expand homeownership opportunities and some of the challenges to achieving that potential. The Joint Center has published 2 of what will be 3 papers examining this. Chris will be talking about that. Chris will talk for about 35 to 40 minutes. That'll be followed by a Q&A that I will moderate. Feel free to leave questions in the Q&A feature on Zoom. A couple of Chris's co-authors will be curating those questions, so they'll answer some online, and they will type answers, and I'll also pose some of them to Chris. Apologies in advance, we may not get to all of your questions. We'll end at about 1:15 p.m. A video of the event and Chris's slides will be posted early next week. Chris, it's all yours.
Thank you, David. It's great to be here with you, and welcome everyone. Here, let me share my screen. Oh, hold on. I think I know how to do this by now. Hopefully you can all see that now. If there's any problem, David will let me know. So as David said, today's talk's on the potential and challenges of using manufactured housing to expand entry-level home ownership. And what I'll be talking about really is going to cover 3 reports, a series of 3 reports the Joint Center has put out, 2 of which are already out, one of which is in editing stages, will be out sometime in the next month. The first one was a study comparing the costs of manufactured and site-built housing to kind of do a deeper dive on whether, to what extent manufactured housing actually does have a significant cost advantage. The second one was a review of barriers to greater use of manufactured housing for entry-level homeownership, largely a literature review, a detailed literature review. And then the forthcoming one is some case studies of promising practices for overcoming those barriers to expand the use of this housing. I want to give a shout out to my co-authors on these papers, Dan McHugh and Alex Herman of the Joint Center. Chad Reed has been really foundational, is a former graduate of the Graduate School of Design here, now works for Ivory Innovations. And then James Shen, who's a former Loeb Fellow at the GSD and who is the principal and founder of People's Architecture Office. And so all these folks contributed to these reports. Let me give you a roadmap for what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to start by giving just an overview of what is manufactured housing and then review trends and characteristics of this sector to kind of orient us to why we care about manufactured housing. And then I'll dip into the findings from our cost comparison study. And following up that, I'm going to provide some estimates of where we think manufactured housing holds the most potential for expansion and how many buyers this might serve if we were to expand the availability of this housing. then review findings from our barrier study and preliminary results from our upcoming case studies. So a fair amount of ground to cover, so let me dig into it. So an overview of manufactured housing. So for those of you who aren't familiar with this, pre-1976, these were known as mobile homes or travel homes, trailer homes, and they proliferated in the period after World War II to meet a growing demand for cheap housing at a time when housing was not widely available. That image right there to the right is this kind of first generation of manufactured housing that looks for all the world like an RV that's been parked somewhere. But to address the health and safety of these homes, in 1976, HUD established the Manufactured Home Construction and Safety Standards, all called for shorthand the HUD Code, and they ushered in a new generation of these homes. The HUD Code has undergone multiple revisions over time to improve the quality of the homes and to deal with and improve the quality of their installation. And the image here at the right, in the lower right, is one of these more modern manufactured homes. A key nomenclature issue is that with the promulgation of the 1976 HUD Code, the term manufactured housing was introduced explicitly to distinguish these homes from the early generation homes that were not built to that code, which are referred to as typically as mobile homes. Briefly, just to distinguish manufactured from modular housing. So the HUD Code supersedes state and local building codes, which allow for the mass production of these homes that can be shipped to markets across the country. So these factories are going to be overseen by HUD inspectors to make sure that they're meeting the HUD Code. But once they meet that HUD Code and have a label put on them that they meet the HUD Code, they have the right legally to be placed in any state in the country. Modular housing is also factory built, and the images I have here at the right are images of modules being built in a factory to be assembled on site into a home. But they must comply with all state and local building codes. They have no special exemption. And so that means that they have to be some process put in place for the homes to be inspected in the factory by agents of whatever state or locality the homes will ultimately be placed in. So manufactured, don't just assume factory built. This is very specifically referring to as HUD Code homes. A little bit on the typologies of homes. So the kind of classic and simplest manufactured home is a single section home, sometimes referred to as a single wide. And then here we have a rendering by James Shen of a prototype of these homes. They're very long and narrow. They have a kind of a fairly flat roof pitch. They sit on pilings rather than on a foundation set in the ground, so they tend to sit up high. They often have vinyl siding and vinyl skirting to hide the piers that they're placed on. The bottom image here is a double section, sometimes referred to as a double wide, having similar design features as the single section home, but is obviously twice as large or thereabouts from putting two of these together, and creating what looks more like a ranch home. Now, a third typology, a new typology of homes, is created by the manufactured home industry as a way of addressing some of the aesthetic concerns about manufactured housing, and also some of the other physical aspects of the home. And the key features here, as you can see in the illustration to the right, the roof pitch is now steeper to resemble more of a traditional site-built home. The homes are set in a permanent foundation, lower to the ground, no more than 30 inches, but sometimes even lower. They'll have 6-inch eaves. They have to have engineered wood siding. And in addition to these visible features, they are held to higher energy efficiency standards, and the interior materials of cabinets and walls and finishings in bathrooms are of a higher standard. Notably, they also have 2 or 3 features required, 2 of 3 features: a front porch, a dormer, and a garage. So all of these things you can see from this typology looks very much almost indistinguishable, really, from a single-family ranch home. And this is a newer form of housing that is also eligible for special treatment through lending programs of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And we'll talk more about this as a potentially a form of manufactured housing that holds potentially good opportunities for expanding use of this home. Let's talk a little bit about the scale of the market, some characteristics of the market. So what I'm showing you on this chart is the number of shipments of manufactured homes from factories going back to 1976 when that HUD code was promulgated up until last year. The bars are showing you the number of shipments, and then that line is showing you those shipments as a share of single-family starts for that year. If you look prior to 2000, in the period from 1976 to 2000, the volume of manufactured homes was quite high, averaged about 250,000 a year, followed kind of similar cycles as the building industry. You can see in the 1990s, it had a particularly large surge of construction reaching more than 350,000 homes shipped per year. And as the line shows you, the manufactured home volume as a percentage of single family reached about 30% at that point. So for every million single family homes produced, 300,000 manufactured homes were being shipped. So a really significant portion of the single family home market. And research done by the Joint Center in the late 1990s found that, in fact, when we look at the homeownership boom in the 1990s, manufactured housing accounted for a significant proportion of the increase in low-income homeowners. So it has a history of being a particularly important source of entry-level housing. You can see from this chart that around 2000, the industry went through a severe downturn. And really, the manufactured housing industry experienced the subprime lending crisis before the rest of the market did. There were loans were made on very easy terms that allowed for people to be able to acquire manufactured homes and very easily. In fact, too easily. The volume of homes was excessive. People were defaulting on their loans. As they defaulted on their loans and the homes were repossessed, it created a glut of homes in the market. And that led to this self-reinforcing, very significant downward cycle. And so much has happened in the single-family home market in the middle 2000s, around 2000, that happened in the manufactured home market. But as you can see, the industry has never, since that time, regained the scale that it had prior to that crisis. Since about 2010, that's when manufactured home shipments fell to less than 50,000 in a single year, a fraction of what it had been for a long time. And since that time, it's slowly increased to now about 115,000 in recent years, and accounting for about 10% relative to the scale of single-family homes. So the potential for the manufactured home market has really was decimated by that crisis and has yet to fully recover. A few other quick facts. If we think about manufactured homes, people tend to think about mobile home parks or communities, often where the land, if not the home itself, is also rented. But this chart is showing you the distribution of 10 years of manufactured home. On the right-hand side, you can see that about half, 46% of people living in manufactured homes own both the home and the land on which it's sited. So traditionally, what we think of as home ownership. On the upper left-hand side, you can see there's another quarter, roughly 26%, of folks who own the home, but actually rent the land on which it's sited. So that may take place in a mobile home community where you buy the home, but you still have to pay a rent for the land. And in the lower quadrant there to the left, another quarter, 26%, rent both the home and the land. So at some level, if you say the home ownership rate of these units is both the ones that own the unit and or the land, it's about 76%, but only half actually own both. In terms of where manufactured home is most prevalent, this is showing you the share of housing accounted for by manufactured homes by state. Dark green are places where the share is above 12.5%. Nationally, overall, it's about 5.6% of homes are manufactured homes. The lime green shade is that 5 to 10%. So those are places where roughly average, maybe a little above average manufactured homes. And then the light yellow are places where it's only 2 to 5%. And so areas where they're much less frequent. And you can see that they're heavily concentrated in the South, the Southeast in particular. New Mexico has a fair number of homes, often, as does Wyoming. It's a common form of housing on Native American reservations as well, which is reflected there in the map. If we look then at the number of units, both by region, but also by whether you're in a large metropolitan area, small or medium metropolitan area, or a rural area. This chart is showing you that these homes are heavily concentrated in the South. This is showing you the number of units, about 8 million total manufactured housing units across the country. A really large concentration of those are in the South. In the South, they're in both rural areas and in small and medium metros. In the Midwest, they're much more concentrated in rural areas. They're very rare in many respects in the Northeast. And in the West, they're somewhat more common and equally spread out across large, small metros and rural areas. And in many cases, the housing that's located in metro areas may well have been in what was a rural or an exurban area back in the 70s and 80s that has since been subsumed within a growing metropolitan area. But think Southern for sure, and think rural, although underappreciated is the fact that these homes are also not uncommon in particularly small and medium metropolitan areas. This table just gives you a few facts of the counties where homes are more or less prevalent. So what we did was we took every county in the country, estimated the share of manufactured housing in that county, put them into those counties into quintiles. In the left column here, we have low share. So these are the areas where manufactured housing is least common. Middle is the middle of the average counties, and the right are the counties where manufactured housing is most prevalent. If you look at that top line, you can see that where they're least prevalent, they make about 2.5% of the stock, and where they're most prevalent, they make up more than a quarter of the stock. Jump down to the second line there, you'll see that the home values vary quite substantially and consistently across these areas, with higher valued home markets having less and the lowest valued home markets having more. The population density is strongly correlated here as well, with the areas that are most prevalent for manufactured housing having 84 people per square mile compared to 2,200 people per square mile in the places where it's least common. Home ownership rates don't vary significantly across these three groupings, ranging only from 69 to 73%. But if you look at the BIPAC home ownership rate, it varies quite a bit, from 48 to 60%. Manufactured housing in the South is particularly common in areas where African Americans are predominant, and for them, it's a really important form of home ownership. And the bottom line, lastly, is incomes. And again, reflecting the house values, incomes are lower in areas where homes are most prevalent. All right, that's the lay of the land for manufactured housing, its volume, trends, and where it's found. Let's turn to our first study, one looking at the comparison, the cost of manufactured homes to site-built homes. Let me start off by talking about our methodology. To get estimates of the cost of construction, we relied on, which included the cost of construction, transportation, and siting of the home. So not just the cost at when it leaves the factory door, but to get it onto a site and affixed to that site, all the costs involved in that. We relied on a survey that was conducted by Next Step Network. Thank you, Next Step, for making that available to us. And also we were able to get access to this information and to interpret it with the help of manufacturedhomes.com. Chris Nicely, being the principal there, we're indebted to both of those organizations for their help with this study. But they provided this survey data that was a survey of 22 different manufacturers, dealers, and lenders. This was conducted in early 2020, so pre-COVID. And they had a very detailed breakdown of the cost of the home, the cost of transportation, the cost of site preparation, and the like. And they got 22 different responses to that. And we took the average of those responses to get the cost for these homes. To compare that, we used the construction cost estimating software from RS Means, a large respected national source of construction estimating software. And we put in comparably sized and modest quality site-built homes that were the same square footage, same bathrooms, same bedrooms, picking features and appliances and HVAC systems that were as comparable as we could get them to be able to get the cost of a comparable cost of a site-built home. The survey, and we use RS Means to also generate estimates for West Coast states that have higher costs of construction, both, as it turns out, for site-built as well as for manufactured homes. Those estimates are included in the paper and are largely similar, although higher than the estimates that I'll share with you today, which are for the nation as a whole. And again, we use RS Means to estimate these for the same time period in 2020. So it's pre-COVID, pre all that inflation. So the level of costs may not be comparable to what they are today, but we believe since inflation largely affected these sectors similarly, We don't think it changes the story in terms of relative costs. I should also note caveat-wise that while we use the estimates to control for as many elements of quality and size as possible, there will no doubt still be differences in both design and the materials used that may account for some of the differences between the site-built and the manufactured homes. So that's what we did. Let me turn to the results. So this table includes the principal findings, and let me just highlight a few things. So when we're doing this, we're looking at 3 different types of home, at those typologies I illustrated at the beginning: a single section, a double section, and a cross-mod home. And so for each of those homes, we estimate the comparable site-built cost equivalent. You can see here, I show you that the numbers of square footage of the homes. So the site-built cross-mod and double section home are 1,568 square feet. The single section home is 1,216 square feet. The difference between the cross-mod and the double section is the addition of a porch, a garage, and a dormer, which we had to add those additional costs to it. And because of the other features of the cross-mod home, the manufactured home version is more expensive than the double section as well. So we have those 3 types. Each one has its own site-built comparison. We show here the details. So we have the building cost. So that's the cost out of the factory of the structure. The foundation cost. And so for the site-built home, that's all the prep for the foundation it'll sit on. For the manufactured home, it's typically a pier style system that the home is affixed to, so that those costs will be cheaper. But manufactured home have transportation installation costs, which include getting the home to the site, affixing it to the site, putting up skirting and other factors as well. So those costs are not evident for the site-built home. They are for the manufactured home. Lastly, both have an assumption about administration and profit being a similar fixed share of costs for both of those, realizing the total cost. So to cut to the bottom line, if we then look at the cost for the site-built home versus the manufactured home, we find that the cross-mod comes in at 73% of the cost of equivalent site-built home. The double section home comes in at 60% of the equivalent cost of a site-built home, and a single section is only 35%. So really substantial cost savings are evident from this survey in the cost of producing manufactured homes. Now, in the paper, we also cite earlier study done by HUD in the late 1990s, which came to very similar conclusions, perhaps not surprisingly, as it used a very similar methodology using RS means and the like. But these results are consistent with what has been found in the past. We don't have any insights from the nature of the information we have about what is driving those cost savings. And so let me just present to you the hypothesis, the conventional wisdom, as it were, about why it is that manufactured housing would be more cost effective. One is just simply efficiency in production from being produced in a controlled factory setting. So there's no weather delays. You're able to produce the parts and pieces you need, the time you need them. So all of that happens in a much more efficient way. There's the vertical integration of the production processes. So rather than have to have a separate contractor for electrical, plumbing, roofing, framing, all of those are done in the factory. And reducing those subcontractors both makes the timelines more efficient, but also reduces the need for profit at each stage of the process. So those are all vertically integrated and realize cost savings for the final product. There's material savings in terms of purchasing appliances, roofing materials, siding, wood for hundreds and thousands of homes and not just individual site-built homes, produces great buying power and produces efficiencies there. You can incorporate advanced fabrication machinery as needed into producing, cutting down lumber or other things that would be harder to do in a site-built home situation. Factories are located in low-cost labor markets. So rather than having to build the homes in places where labor is expensive, they're built in more rural communities where the cost of labor and the cost of living are cheaper. And then lastly, and this is very hard to document, but differences in the HUD code. The HUD code is not the same as the building code that is used for site-built homes. And so there may be cost advantages embedded in that code that are either more efficient from a design or building materials standpoint. So we don't know which of these things or to what extent these different factors contribute, but our estimates suggest that taken all together, they are quite substantial. The one thing I want to point out, though, is that our costs are just for the cost of the constructing the home itself and not for the cost of the finished lot on which that home will sit. And so while there may be significant advantages in the cost of construction, you have to look at the all-in cost and not just the home, but also the land on which it sits. One thing we did then is we brought data on lot prices that are estimated by the American Enterprise Institute. And the footnote here directs you to the site. The paper does as well. And they had estimates for 2020 at the county level for the entire country. We looked at the distribution of lot prices in the country and then incorporated that distribution of lot prices into our cost of construction to see how much does that affect the cost advantage. So here, if you look at the gray bars, $65,000 was roughly the median county cost for a finished lot across the country. You can see here that, well, when we had no land cost, the cross mod had a 73%. That was 73% of the site built home. Adding land, it declines to 80%. Similarly, for the double section and single section home, the initial cost advantage of manufactured housing is eroded as land prices are taken into account, since those will be the same for both forms of housing. At the extreme, when we looked at the 90th percentile county, where land prices were $185,000 per lot, you can see there that the manufactured home advantage shrinks to 86%, 80%, and 70% respectively. And so this all points to the fact that manufactured housing will be particularly advantageous in areas where land costs are low. And as land costs get higher, the fact that the construction costs are low will start to get diminished, although not entirely eliminated, by those land costs. All right. So we find that manufactured housing has a big cost advantage. So how much is the potential of this for expanding opportunities for home ownership? So I noted earlier we had that table giving the characteristics of counties where they're most prevalent. One of the factors that really stood out is the fact that in areas where house prices are lower, manufactured homes are more common. And this goes back to the point I just made about land prices, that when land prices are higher, that cost advantage shrinks. So we have a working hypothesis or suggestion, presumption, that areas where housing costs are lower will be more amenable to having greater adoption of manufactured housing. Coupled with that, we thought we should look at places where housing costs, land costs are low, but the prevalence of manufactured housing is low, as areas where there is potentially much more room to make up. So we created this typology of counties that have low share manufactured housing, and these are ones that are in the bottom 2 quintiles by manufactured housing share, and low or high price of home. Here we took just the 20% of counties with the highest housing costs as high costs and all the rest as low costs. Across the 3,000 counties in the US, the top 20 are going to be the ones that are most urbanized, and those house prices are really much more skewed to the high end. So in the bottom 4 quintiles of price, bottom 2 quintiles of manufactured housing share, those are places where the land prices seem to be amenable, there's not much inroads, and they have the greatest potential for manufactured housing to provide more entry-level home ownership. The row I have circled is that category of counties, and we found there was 845 of those out of the total 3,000 across the country. If we then look at how many renter households are in those counties, and there we're taking middle-income renter households making between $50,000 and $100,000, just as an approximation for what might be a lower-end entry-level homeowner market. And we found that there are about 3.2 million renter households, so potential home buyers in those markets that have incomes at that more modest level that might be folks who would benefit from this. So that's a pretty robust market. And here, if you look across at those different categories, we have large metro, central county, large metro, not central county, smaller, medium metro, and non-metro. Interestingly, while manufactured housing has been much more concentrated in rural areas, there's real potential here in large urban counties. Think places where heavily concentrated with single family housing, there's perhaps been a lot of loss of housing, empty lots, house prices are very low. There's a real opportunity for manufactured housing as infill housing, or in some of those smaller or medium metro areas where housing prices aren't high, they're low density. Both of those are areas we think have a lot of potential for manufactured housing to provide more opportunities for homeownership. Just to give you a flavor of how these places play out spatially, the pink areas are those places with low share manufactured housing and low housing costs. The bright red areas are low share of manufactured housing and high housing costs areas. So places where it's probably most difficult, California, some of the mountain states, Northeast. But the areas that are pink are heavily concentrated across broad swaths of the Midwest, where land prices are low. And manufactured housing has not been as prevalent in the Midwest as it has, say, in the South. But if you stare carefully at this map, you'll see that those pink areas are actually scattered throughout. And many of those are urban counties that have great potential. Here's just a listing, which is probably going to test your eyesight, but the paper provides the same list of large urban counties with high potential for manufactured housing. The map of the right kind of maps those. You can see they're scattered across the Northeast, the Midwest and the South, and a little bit in the Mid-Atlantic or region as well. Places like Birmingham, Jacksonville, Indianapolis, Louisville, Baltimore, Grand Rapids, Detroit. All these markets that you see on the right-hand side have fairly low median household incomes. They have very low density stock, so they have a lot of single-family homes, but very little manufactured housing. So we think that given the cost advantage of manufactured housing and given the market conditions in these places, lots of potential for manufactured housing. All right, barriers to greater use. This was our second paper. I'm going to give you a very brief overview of the findings. It's a very detailed paper. It's intended to be a fairly exhaustive and thorough literature review on the barriers to manufactured housing. So it's a great resource, I think, if you want to dig into these issues. I'll give you the kind of high-level summary today. In terms of the key barriers, so the number one barrier in many respects is lingering negative perceptions of mobile homes. That's really, we would argue, not in keeping with improvements in quality over time. So the lit review will go through this evidence about negative consumer perceptions, various studies that have been done about what people's attitudes toward manufactured housing. We look at things like resident satisfaction with the homes and the like. We look at changes in measures of objective quality. We look at appreciation rates. We find that the quality, while slightly lower, is not significantly lower. We find the appreciation rates are comparable, slightly lower again, but not appreciably lower. We find that people's attitudes about these homes by a recent Freddie Mac study have actually improved over time, but there's still a large share of American citizens who don't really have either a good awareness of them, or if they do, they have that negative perception. So this continues to be an issue. If you think back to those pictures I showed you earlier of the trailer, which are so evident when you're driving down the road in the rural counties, those are kind of emblazoned in people's minds. There was one study looking at this and said what's ironic is that the newer forms of manufactured housing that are exactly the ones that can start to undermine or change those perceptions of negative quality aren't viewed as manufactured housing, so they can't change that perception. So issues about negative perceptions are certainly a barrier. Zoning and land use restrictions that can make it difficult or ban them entirely are also significant issues. And this is closely related to the perceptions. Those zoning regulations and those barriers are all predicated on the idea that this is not good quality housing that will have a negative effect on the surrounding community. There's been detailed studies that have been done looking at the extent of these barriers and then looking at their correlation with how much manufactured housing there is. I would say that statistically, the correlations aren't that strong, but they're related to a lot of market forces as well that cite where these homes are. But there's no question that there are many, many communities where manufactured housing is either not allowed or only allowed with a special use permit that requires a detailed review, which is also often very difficult to get through. Now, there are a number of states, about 20 if memory serves, where there are state requirements that localities either cannot ban manufactured housing outright or have to allow it at least in some portions of their town as of right. And those laws can help to expand the ability to site manufactured housing. But the big but that they often do not have anything to say about design standards that municipalities can impose beyond whether or not the home is manufactured. Things like roof pitch, height of the foundation, type of the foundation, the nature of the exterior cladding. So what even in municipalities where they don't ban manufactured housing, they may still have these design standards that have the effect of acting like a ban. And so zoning and land use restrictions are another significant factor affecting ability to site manufactured homes. I've already mentioned market conditions and particularly land costs. I think the study by HUD from 2011 that was one of the most detailed examinations of these factors, looking at zoning, but also found the thing that econometrically, statistically, that explained most of the variation were market conditions, including land costs, incomes, and whether or not there's a history of manufactured homes in those communities, which seems to be associated with greater acceptance of these homes. One thing that really struck me is the unique supply chain for manufactured housing, which relies on dealers to sell home to home buyers who then have to site that home on their own land. So you think about the process of, I would like to buy a home, and you typically go out and look what's for sale, what's listed, you find it out in the market, and you would buy the home, all sited, ready to go. Here you have to buy the home, find the land, get the loan, site it on the land. Meanwhile, when you buy the home, it's personal property. After you get it sited attached to a permanent foundation, it may be entitled as real estate. This is a very complicated process. And dealers don't want to act as developers, and developers have a hard time entering this market given the specialized nature of it. So the unique supply chain for manufactured housing has been a barrier to the greater expansion of these homes. And then last but not least, challenges in obtaining lower cost mortgage financing related both to the specialized nature of lenders in this sector, as well as the difficulty of titling homes as real estate. In order to get a mortgage, the home has to be titled as real estate. Manufactured homes, when they leave the factory, are personal property. And so you have to go through a process to get that titled as real estate. Typically requires being attached to a permanent foundation, multiple other hoops and paperwork that might have to be processed by the state to do that, all of which creates obstacles for a would-be home buyer to be able to get a mortgage, which is typically much lower cost than a personal loan or a chattel loan that's used to finance these properties when they're not real estate. Now, mind you, if you go back to our analysis of the cost advantage of a manufactured home, if you take a home that has, say, a 73% cost advantage, but you finance that with a personal or chattel loan, which might have an interest rate of 8 or 9%, versus a mortgage that might have 4 or 5%. These are based on terms from 2021 from a CFPB study. And that personal property loan has a 23-year term, not a 30-year term. Suddenly, what's a cheaper home becomes a much more expensive monthly mortgage payment. So the access to financing is critical in terms of making sure that that cost advantage of production carries through in terms of a cost advantage in terms of the monthly payment. So there's a lot more in that paper. These are the high level, but really detailed review of the literature. So hopefully a valuable resource. So we conclude that paper by saying, what do we take away from this? And what is it going to take to overcome these barriers? First thing is that because there are multiple barriers, what you're going to need is a multi-pronged effort, because you can't just address one and then leave the others unaddressed. The second is that any starting point is going to have to be about educating the public, educating public officials about the quality of today's manufactured homes in order to be able to both attract demand and get those approvals. Given the importance of local land use regulations, we point to the fact that there's real potential benefit in state acting to overcome these local codes that restrict the ability to site these homes. But importantly, those state regulations need to go beyond just whether or not manufactured housing is prohibited, but also address some of those design standards that end up being the binding issues. There's also a clear need for new supply chains to deliver sited and titled homes for sale in urban areas that address people's desire to be able to buy a home and not become, in essence, a mini developer themselves. And then lastly, financing reforms are needed to expand access to this mortgage financing that would be affordable, not undermine the cost advantage of these homes, reduce denial rates. Denial rates for mortgage applications are much higher in both the mortgage space and the personal property or chattel loan market, and also to improve the operations and costs in the personal loan market, the chattel market, to address the high costs there. All right. Let me get then to the last part of my talk, which is previewing our upcoming case studies of promising approaches. So what we did in this work was to go out and talk to various experts in the field to try to identify places where and developers who were acting to open up new markets for entry-level home ownership in different parts of the country, and to examine these cases to see what we can learn and how they were addressing the barriers we had found. We found 5 examples that we focus on in the report. You hear on the left are the names of the organizations. 2 of them are for-profit developers who are essentially producing subdivisions, one of them in Texas, the other one in Virginia and Maryland. We found 1 case of a local government that was really trying to prime the pump by overcoming barriers and developing pilot manufactured homes to be able to demonstrate a case for private sector actors. And then we found 2 cases of nonprofits acting as developers and dealers of manufactured housing to try to expand these. The report will provide more of a profile of these. The one things I would highlight here are the Zillow County median home value. These places do tend to be relatively low-cost markets, with the exception of San Bernardino, California, where NPHS of San Bernardino was using this as largely urban infill to address the need for affordable housing. The right-hand side, I put the typology of counties that I referenced earlier, where lower high cost, lower high share MH. A number of these cases are, in fact, what we would presume, the low MH and low price, but they're actually all over the map, which goes to show that county categorization, while perhaps illustrative, is by no means definitive, in that places where prices are low enough, you can still, even if there's higher than some places of the country, still have opportunities. Let me just show you a couple of examples. On the left-hand side here is a home in the Heights. This is MH Advisors in Petersburg, Virginia. These are very simple homes. You see here no driveway or garage. The developer, in all of these cases, developers are strongly motivated by trying to produce affordable entry-level home ownership and doing what they could to try to keep those costs down. In this case, a lack of a driveway helped, and no garage helped meet that price point, but still an attractive home with a garage and a dormer and all the other features of that cross-mod home that we talked about. On the right, Sparks Homes from Marion, Texas. These were homes that were developed in a large lot, single-family subdivision. I believe these are acre lots, and so the home buyers are getting a lot of land for their money. They're getting a 2-car garage, and again, a spacious home that looks in many respects like a ranch home. Some preliminary conclusions from the case studies. As I said, this report will be out next month with more of the details. Again, all these cases where people were trying to achieve affordability at a price point for entry-level home ownerships. And so the appeal of manufactured housing was very fundamentally, how do we bring down the price? And that the cost advantage of these homes was a huge draw for the folks entering this market. In all these cases, educating local officials and other key players was job one. There were zoning issues in all these places. For the most part, there's also lenders that have to be educated in terms of the loan products and how to appraise these homes. And so all the actors we talked to in these case studies said that education and educating people all along the supply chain as much as you can ahead of time to kind of grease the skids was really important. In virtually all these cases, zoning barriers and local approval processes were significant hurdles to overcome, taking lots of time to get approvals from the local community. San Bernardino didn't have as much of that zoning approvals, in part because of California's laws mandating allowance of them, but they still had issues in terms of building officials and inspectors not being familiar with these homes and having to be brought along to understand the nature of construction and what inspection processes applied. Site selection turned out to be a key element. And for the subdivision folks, Dustin Arp, the owner of Spark Homes in Texas, started out by doing some urban infill, but found that he preferred to do subdivisions where he could control the neighborhood because the impact of surrounding properties on his properties was important. And doing subdivisions, he could control that quality, create his own comps, and was able to get large lots that he found that people found appealing. Other places, urban infill lots, making sure that they're not too hard to reach. that they had utilities, and in MH Advisors, Tom Heineman make sure you had access to appropriate and utilities from the communities was really important. So perhaps this is similar to all development, but site selection was key, in particular with keeping the price down, the cost down, and also keeping the appeal up. All of the developers we talked to had to develop, aside from the city of Jackson, who didn't act as a developer themselves, but had to obtain dealer licenses to become a dealer of manufactured homes, to be able to buy direct from the factory. In the states that we studied, that was a simple process, but some of the folks we talked to reported that in other states, much more complicated to become a dealer. In some places, for example, if you're going to be a dealer, they want you to have a lot where you're going to show model homes. But if you're a developer, you're not going to have a lot to show model homes. You're going to have your development. And so things like that can be barriers to entry in some states, but not in the states we studied. And for all these cases, appraisal and home buyer financing were really important. Again, they were motivated by affordability, and they wanted to know at the end of the day that their buyers were going to get access to long-term, lower-cost mortgage financing. And for that reason, all these cases were focused on the cross-mod home. That cross-mod has the advantage of having lending programs that allow for site-built homes to be used as comparables. Appraisers and lenders understood them better. They had greater acceptance by the communities, and they had strong buyer appeal. And so for these cases, the cross-mod really stood out as an important way of addressing multiple of those barriers. All right, I threw a lot at you. Check out our studies on our website if you want to get more details. But with that, David, I will stop my sharing and take any questions that people might have.
Well, Chris, what a tour de force. Thank you. I was thinking that your presentation, we were talking beforehand, runs a little bit long, but then I realized you were actually presenting 3 papers, not one. And so you actually presented 3 papers on average, much shorter than somebody would present one. Just a huge wealth of questions, which we'll share with you and the other authors, because I think there's some really interesting points in there. And again, apologies, I'm gonna have to pick and choose through here. But there are a couple of things I think that would help for clarification. The first one has to do with lending. You had mentioned historically the way we financed manufactured housing had been an obstacle. And I think you hinted at, and the papers certainly talk about this, that's changing. But I was just wondering if you can expand a little bit on how the way we are financing manufactured housing is changing and what impact that might have.
Sure. And David, it just dawned on me that I don't think I thanked our sponsor for this work, the Pew Charitable Trust. So Rachel Siegel, Alex Horowitz, who we worked very closely in framing these papers and reviewing them. So I failed in the beginning to thank them, but all this work was done with the support of Pew and with Rachel and Alex as key partners. So apologies for forgetting, but I want to make sure I got that in. You say financing, the key thing that's changing in financing, I think, was the advent of this particular loan products that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac have put out for the cross-mod home. And they have definitions of what constitutes a cross-mod that has to do with that roof pitch and the foundation and the presence of porch dormer, garage, the nature of the interior home finishing, the energy efficiency. And with that, you get access to their loan product and also the ability to use site-built housing as a comparable, which is really important in that much older manufactured housing is not in good shape. And if you feel like the only comps you have are manufactured housing, then you're going to be stuck with comparables that are low in value. You may also be developing this housing in areas where there's very little manufactured housing to speak of. And so that's a really important innovation. The GSEs, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, are also under duty to serve obligations to expand lending to manufactured housing for more traditional manufactured housing, meaning not cross-mod. And so that helps to expand that. FHA has been leaning in to making sure that their loan products are also more available for manufactured housing. That all said, research by the CFPB and by the Pew Charitable Trust, it was recently the last year or two, shows that there continues to be significant differences in denial rates between lending for manufactured housing. And that's true of a mortgage. My house is titled as real estate. I'm applying for a mortgage for a manufactured house. 3 times, 5 times more likely to be denied for a manufactured house than for a site-built house. If you're applying for a chattel or personal loan, those denial rates are 7 times as high. So it's still difficult to get approved. The difference in mortgage costs is still noticeable between site-built homes and manufactured homes. For a mortgage, about 7 to 8 percentage parts of a percentage points, not percentage points, but 0.7% higher in a recent study by CFPB. And the chattel loans are twice as high. So while there's been some advances in lending, I think this is an area that's really ripe for further improvements. And one of the things that's been found by studies, again, by CFPB and the Urban Institute and Pew, is that these lending for manufactured housing is heavily concentrated in a small number of lenders, and that lack of competition may be a factor. And the other is that these are very small balance loans, which can be expensive to underwrite, and that can be adding to the cost as well. So certainly an area ripe for further improvements to expand access to good, affordable financing for these homes.
Great. A point I think you touched on, but it's shown up in several questions, and so I just want to make sure that it gets emphasized. Basically, people have been asking about appreciation. Are these newer homes holding their value? And I know, as I said, you touched on it, but can you expand a little bit on what the research is showing in terms of how much these homes hold their value versus a more conventional stick-built house over time?
Sure. I think the key thing to hold in mind here is that we think of housing as appreciating in value. But if you think about it, when you build a house, it's like any other good. It's going to start to depreciate from the time you build it, right? The home, things wear out, the quality of the home deteriorates, it's how modern it is. My appliances are 10 years old. For all those reasons, your home is depreciating all the time. What's not depreciating is the land that your home is sitting on. The reason why house prices keep going up year after year after year is because land prices are appreciating, not the home value. And so the thing with manufactured housing is if you own the land that home is on, then you are likely to experience appreciation as would a site-built home. Now, there are some differences in quality and some differences in demand, but a number of studies, there was a study that I was involved with some 20 years ago by Tom Boehm and Alan Schlotman, who looked at the American Housing Survey and examined changes in value of homes over time and found that there was a slightly less rate of appreciation in manufactured homes, but for the most part, they appreciated over time as long as you own the land. The FHFA did another study recently, the last few years, where they also assessed rates of appreciation in manufactured home versus site-built homes. They came to the same conclusion. So there is some degree of slightly less appreciation, which may have to do with the overall quality of homes at different points in time. It may have to do with the demand for these homes, but it's not, it certainly doesn't depreciate, and the differences aren't substantial. So it's I would say that this is in the category of one of the biggest public misperceptions, that these homes don't appreciate. They certainly do, as long as you own the land.
And that actually is a nice transition. There are a couple questions about, in a sense, you were focusing on that roughly 50% of manufactured housing that people own the housing and they own the land. What are the implications of this work for the quarter where people own the housing but not the land? And I don't think your study looked at this, but if you've got any general sense, there's been certainly a lot of attention to private investors buying up some of those manufactured home communities, and where is that going to lead? So kind of an open-ended question about how do you think about the places where people own the house but not the land, or are renting the house and don't own the land?
That was, just to be clear, that was not the focus of our work. We were very much focused on manufactured housing for entry-level home ownership. We were focusing on a case where we assumed people would own the land. But this is a really important issue, and it is one where there's been a lot of interest by private equity in purchasing mobile. And this is a case where they do use the term mobile home communities for these communities of manufactured homes. It is one where the owners of those homes are particularly vulnerable to rising rents. So if you think about a situation where your rent goes up and then you say, well, gee, I can't afford that. I've got no choice but to move. Well, think about it now where what you got to move is not just yourself, but the actual structure, which is, by the way, attached to a permanent foundation or semi-permanent foundation. These homes, as much as they have that mobile in their original title, are very immobile. They're moved very infrequently. And so you're really held hostage then to the rent increases because of the fact that if it goes up and you can't afford it, you have very little choice. There is an important movement in the manufactured home community world called resident-owned communities, ROC. It was established by an organization out of New Hampshire originally, now ROC USA. And so there's a number of states which give manufactured home communities a right of first refusal upon the sale of the community. And ROC USA and other organizations like that will help them to obtain the financing they need to buy that home and be able that community and maintain it as a resident-owned community and avoid those kind of steep increases in rents going forward. But absent resident-owned communities, there's a lot of vulnerability of folks to rising rents that they have no choice but to pay.
Couple of other questions that are, I think, a little bit on the border of what you did or didn't write about, but I think are at least worth pondering. There was one that said, have you thought about how would a panelized construction compare to this? And I don't know if you also extended that to at least comparing the costs of these new types of housing and modular housing, but where does other forms of factory built housing fit into this continuum?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one that Chad Reed, who was one of the co-authors in that first paper, the cost comparison, wanted to include modular, but I pushed against it because it's a whole different kettle of fish and require a lot of data collection. So the key thing, as I said in my presentation, difference between manufactured housing, HUD code housing, and modular housing is HUD code housing is built to a single federal standard, where modular housing still has to comply, and as is true of panelized, has to still comply with all state and local building codes. So if I'm sitting in Cambridge, Mass, and I'm ordering a modular home from a factory in Pennsylvania, there's got to be some arrangement made for that home to be inspected in Pennsylvania by an inspector approved by Cambridge to make sure it meets the Cambridge building code. And so think about what that means in terms of logistics of having that inspection process take place. And also what it means is that factory is not building necessarily the same module for every part of the country. It's got to build a different module relative to the building codes in different areas. So it takes away an enormous amount of those economies of scale and the vertical integration that I talked about. There's a number of studies. Turner Center at Berkeley has done a lot of great work on offsite construction, which is the general term for factory-built housing, and suggests that modular housing could achieve savings of about 20% in costs when optimized. And so we were unable to document that. So we don't have any insight into that. I take Turner's work as being of good quality, but mind you, that 20% is still less than the savings we were seeing in manufactured housing, which I think goes to the kind of scale and standardization that's been achieved in that industry. So all these forms of offsite construction have great potential for bringing those efficiencies. And a key thing there really has to do with the codes that they're built to and inspection process. And there's talk about how do we create a HUD code-like process for modular housing or panelized housing that will allow those greater efficiencies to be realized and having them subject to all these different codes.
One last clarification question. I'm gonna take moderator's prerogative and let us run over a minute or two. I thought some really interesting questions about, and again, I don't know if you looked at this, how manufactured housing is being treated both by insurers and also by local governments in terms of property taxes. So if I build one of the sort of new era, manufactured homes, is it being taxed the same, or is local government saying, well, that's a manufactured house, it's not worth as much, and therefore maybe we don't want it? And again, it may not have been something that you looked at, but it got raised, as I said, in several questions. And a similar dynamic, as I said, with home insurance.
So I don't have a great insight of this. I'll share a few thoughts. On the insurance side, manufactured homes built, say, prior to the 1990s, was definitely subject to much greater damage from storms. And that led to significant improvements in the HUD code relative to inspections. In fact, I think the HUD code was extended to cover the installation process as well. And so the newer manufactured homes are built to standards and installed to standards that make them withstand incredibly high winds. And so I think their durability in the face of storms is much better. And I think in latest hurricanes in Florida, these homes have been shown to stand up well. My presumption would be that then is reflected in the fact insurance rates shouldn't be that much higher for new manufactured homes, but I'm not sure about older homes. In terms of taxes, I think that the property taxes will be a combination of the value of the land and the value of the structure, and for the most part, they ought to be comparable. One key thing here, though, is related to financing. And so if it's titled as real estate, it'll be taxed as real estate. If it's personal property, it'll be taxed as personal property. And in a number of states, the personal property tax rate would be less than the property tax rate. And so one of the things that analysts and advocates for this market look at is, of the homeowners who own both the home and the land, and therefore eligible to title the home as real estate, which would make you eligible to get a mortgage loan, a number of folks, I believe the CFPB had one study, 17% of folks who own both the land and the home got a chattel loan anyway. And in those cases, one reason is that people find that the real estate tax is higher than the personal property tax, and they would rather keep it titled as personal property than turn it into real property. And so tax rates can affect that decision. But I don't think they're really different in terms of how the municipality would treat them from a real estate.
A locality that is sort of doing some of the things that you're suggesting might also say, we're going to allow this, but it's got to be, it's going to be real estate, not chattel. So
yeah, I mean, in our case studies, there's a couple of cases, I believe, at least one, that the developer found that the community didn't allow manufactured home, but when they told them what they were going to do, they said, well, as long as you title as real estate, we'll approve it. And so I think that kind of allayed the municipality's fear about the kind of mobility or the chattel nature of the property. So,
well, we've gone even slightly past time. Again, apologies. Just a tremendous set of questions, which we will share with the authors. There's clearly significant interest in this. I was thinking that, as we've often joked, that the Joint Center is sometimes known as the Joint Center for Doom and Gloom. And this is a really, I think, important and fascinating study because it really points to, an approach that could really address some of the key underlying issues, and draws on history to say this can work. And there are ways to make it work even better. I think this is just a terrific example of the great work that the Joint Center does. And I want to thank you for just a phenomenal, I think, overview of a really important piece of work. So thank you very much. All of you who have attended online, thank you for joining us. And we'll see you, albeit virtually, again in about 2 weeks for Aisha Densmore Bay's presentation on artist developers. Thanks, Chris.
thanks, David.